terror, fright, disgust, horror. The genre that has scared and repulsed people for centuries all over the world. It started with stories, and as time progressed, those stories became books, films, TV shows, and video games. Horror culture has become so prevalent in everyday life that most people don't even recognize it when they encounter it. Fear tactics have been used in propaganda and advertisements for decades. Blood-sucking monsters from old stories have become the fantasies of teenage girls. Eventually, certain topics lose their attraction. People today aren't scared of the same things as in the 1920s. But new ideas keep emerging. New fears. As cultures exchange their worst nightmares, they create stories that will terrify people all around the world. For one reason or another, people are drawn to horror culture. People go to the theater to see horror movies and sit down to play horror games with the intention of scaring themselves. There is something just so enticing about a superficial feeling of fear. By exploring history, one will discover horror to be an outlet, a distraction, and a form of persuasion. It's these things that have made it so common in today's life. So where did it all begin? The roots of filmed horror can be traced back to the late 1700s. It was influenced by the literature genre Gothic horror, which included works of writers such as Mary Shelley and Edgar Allan Poe. It was these works that gave inspiration to filmmakers and led to the French director Georges Méliès shooting the short film The House of the Devil in 1896. It was filmed after the invention of motion picture technology and cameras in 1890 and is credited as being the first horror movie. The evolution of horror came from the most influential horror films created throughout the 1920s. Prior to World War I, Expressionism in Germany was developed into the form of film. Movies such as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu came out of this time period. By the end of the 1920s, the revolutionary German filmmakers that started the Expressionist movement came to America, where they changed cinema forever. In the early 30s, the horror films Dracula and Frankenstein were considered to have come out during the golden age of horror film, the period when horror films and their conventions were all set out and not tested upon, and the audience knew exactly what they were in for while watching the film.
Now I know what it feels like to be God.
The success of these films go hand in hand with the history of the time period. This might have been the golden age for horror cinema, but outside of the stories, the 30s was the era of the Great Depression in the United States. This was a time when fears struck across the nation, which made it easy for people to identify with the tone and emotions of the movies. They also served as a distraction from the horrors of the real world. In theory, the beginning of the popularization of horror and the beginning of cycling subgenres are based on this time period.
Here's Johnny.
One way to describe the process of rotating subgenres is the idea of horror cycles. Each cycle follows the rise and fall in popularity of a subgenre. The 1930s is known as the first cycle of horror, when horror films were being produced in America at Universal Pictures. This was the monster era with movies like Dracula and Frankenstein that ended in the mid-1940s. Pulp science fiction was the next and very brief horror cycle that ended in 1950. From there it was a Hammer Gothic horror cycle which featured sequels and remakes of the monster era, and an Edgar Allan Poe cycle that featured The Raven and The Fall of the House of Usher, all between 1957 and 1974. 1973 to 2013 horror movie cycles consisted of the Occult cycle that produced Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist, and the Shark horror cycle which produced Jaws. These are only half of the horror cycles this industry has produced. Others range from slasher to found footage. The reasons these cycles don't last is because of a boom and fade cycle. The cycle will only be popular for so long until the sub-veneers and sequels that follow it turn it into a joke, making it fail. Horror culture surrounds us in our everyday life, whether we recognize it or not. It's found in books, TV shows, games, and even things as seemingly innocent as advertising. TV stations play horror movies every day. Just flipping through the channels one day can lead to watching a horror film. For example, FearNet was a television network that specialized in horror entertainment. Due to FearNet and other stations that play horror movies, regularly or occasionally people end up coming across horror movies. Even if it isn't encountered directly from horror films, other types of movies contain horror aspects. Twilight is classified as a drama, fantasy, and romance, but it contains the horror aspect of vampires. This aspect stems from old vampire movies such as Nosferatu and Dracula. Similar to Twilight, the television show Being Human on the Sci-Fi Channel is classified as a drama, fantasy, and horror. It contains ghosts, werewolves, vampires, and more. These are examples of horror being toned down and blended with other genres for more modern audiences. This makes it easier to experience horror culture every day without even realizing it. It is common to find horror aspects in a large quantity of shows and movies that are not classified as horror. Alongside television, there are a very large amount of horror novels and famous horror authors. The author R.L. Stine is famous for his horror series Goosebumps, which is aimed toward children. Goosebumps was turned into a TV series and recently a movie. His works have turned his net worth into $200 million. The amount of people buying and seeing his work shows the large encounter of horror culture in society. Another author, Edgar Allan Poe, has become an important historical figure. His works of horror are read in schools as required reading, which exposes students to horror culture. Other popular required reading material for students is Beowulf. Beowulf is thought to be one of the earliest horror stories and is one way students experience horror culture in everyday life. Unexpectedly, horror culture is most encountered daily through advertisements. Advertisements can be seen on TV, YouTube, at the beginning of movies, on posters, billboards, online, and more. Many advertisements include fear tactics that make the viewer unsettled. Horror movie and show trailers can be seen anywhere but are mostly encountered on YouTube and TV commercials. They give the viewer a sample of the superficial fear that horror movies usually provide. Horror culture can also be seen in advertisements that are trying to convey a message. Advertisements that are against smoking often depict images of gore and murder to scare people away from the deadly habit. While horror is encountered in life more often than expected, it would not be effective without an exchange of ideas taking place. Countries exchange ideas to create fears that scare people of all different backgrounds. The most common type of these exchanges is movie remakes. It has become common for American production companies to remake old Japanese horror movies. The Ring, made in 2002, was the first of many American remakes. It was based off the original Japanese movie Ringu and made $120 million in the box office. The amount of money brought in by one remake was enough to spark an entirely new horror cycle consisting of similar remakes. Another famous remake is The Grudge. It was released in 2004 and is based off the original Japanese movie Ju-on the Grudge. In its opening weekend, it made $40 million in the box office. Another way horror is exchanged between cultures is when people of different cultural backgrounds come together to work on a project. A prime example of this is the canceled video game project Silent Hills. Set to be the 10th installment of the famous Silent Hill video game franchise, Silent Hills was being created by Japanese game designer Hideo Kojima and Mexican film director Guillermo del Toro. The collaboration between the two promised great ideas for the new game, leaving gamers disappointed at the announcement of its cancellation. Horror has been more prevalent in society than one might realize. It has been a popular theme throughout history, originating with stories and continuing on to books, films, TV shows, and video games. It is even present in more common things such as advertising. Ideas are often exchanged between cultures to create more effective scares. This allows for horror to cycle over time and keeps the genre from dying out. Thanks to all of these elements, horror culture is inescapable.